Johannes Kepler, who made his mark in the early 1600s, would still say to us today, look at the physical evidence, not at the doctrine. Kepler would say to us, open your eyes and your mind, for then the plain reality that you would thereby see, which has stared mankind into the face for millennia unrecognized, is that empire and war is undeniably a single conception and expression, a singularity of one that is the most horrendous crime against humanity and life that threads through all time as the infinite crime. And Kepler might add, don't you dare being indifferent to this. It is by indifference that a society loses its civilization, and subsequent to this loss it loses its life. And so it will always be. Long before society commits the crime of war, it has committed the folly of indifference, whereby it had lost its humanity and opened the gate to empire. The dying and destruction that results from the process are always subsequent, nor is anyone exempt from prosecution for the infinite crime. Under the U.S. Constitution, it is illegal for the USA, its government, and its institutions to attack another nation. Every form of military force is illegal on constitutional grounds, unless the force is used to fend off aggression against the USA on its own territory. The recent concurrent House Resolution 107 reiterates this long-standing constitutional principle under this highest law of the land. Therefore, all the wars since the end of World War II that the USA has started and became involved in were perpetrated illegally as crimes against the nation. Likewise, all those who have voted in Congress in support of starting the illegal wars have voted illegally and are thereby liable for prosecution for their crime. This includes all the presidents who have championed those illegal wars, including all persons of lesser ranks below the president or Congress who have obeyed the president's orders for war, who have, by their obedience, committed the crimes of war. They are thereby liable for prosecution. And this goes many ranks deep. No authority, no matter how great, has the legal right to order a person or institution to commit a crime against the nation, against humanity, and against life itself. The great powers that are given to leaders in high office do not come with a free license attached to commit crimes against the nation and humanity and life itself with impunity. Those who commit those crimes, whether they are presidents, senators, congressmen, or chiefs of staff of the armed forces, and so on, render themselves as common criminals by their committing those crimes. On this basis, the enormous damage that has been done to the nations and to individuals in the course of the numerous illegal wars becomes a liability for which compensation can be technically demanded from the individuals involved, including from the person of the president and from the USA as a nation in which name the crimes of war were perpetrated, and in addition from the entire worldwide empire apparatus that stood behind all the great mass of crimes of war in history, as the instigator of them in every case. while the global compensation claims for damages done to people and nations by the infinite crime can never be paid out in money as a recompense, because the damage cuts too deep to be simply plastered over with money. Nor is there enough money in the world to do so, as the claims for the crime damage would be infinite in size, corresponding to the infinite damage that was done. The USA could, however, instead commit itself to a more meaningful recompense by powerfully aiding economic development around the world. Thus, to aid the world by all means possible to have a future once again, a future with advanced food development, transportation development, energy development, and scientific and technological development. On this platform, all future wars can be avoided. When a commitment to universal humanity is re-established, including the wars that are presently planned against Syria and Iran, with Russia and China intended to be the next target. Unfortunately, the world is moving in the opposite direction. We are moving back to the stage of the 30 Years' War, where roving armed gangs named armies were ravaging the European lands for 30 years in defense of the system of empire of various types against the common aim of humanity for sovereignty, dignity, and freedom. The Peace of Westphalia that stopped the madness effectively ended the policy of empire that might equals right. We see a regression again to the pre-Westphalia madness of roaming armed gangs, and this is happening now on a global scale in a nuclear-armed world and with radioactive uranium gas warfare. The highest laws of the land, hard won over centuries, are now routinely thrown out of the window in a regression to the old inhumanity of gang warfare under the modern term of the coalition of the willing, a coalition of willing criminals, where, once again, might equals right. On this platform, many small nations have been destroyed with overwhelming force that were unable to defend themselves, such as Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and so on, with Syria, Iran, Russia, and China to be next in line. The scourge of the street gang tactics have become the strategic platform of the Western world. The difference is that the street gangs have not yet achieved the sophistication of the imperial process for legitimizing their crime. The street gangs do not yet call themselves the coalitions of the willing when they commit their criminal acts, but they do know that a lone woman is easily overcome and robbed by the superior force of ganged thugs. The ganging up process is now applied against entire nations, militarily. Whoever wants to join the gang is welcome. That's what the advertisements say. Entire nations are now drawn into the gang trap, where the coordinated command structures and strategies add to the overwhelming might. The modern coordinated wars are all offensive wars. The targeted nations are attacked because they refuse to play the dictated imperial games. Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Iran, Russia, China have never attacked the USA or threatened it, yet they are brutally attacked and destroyed, or are so threatened to be destroyed by the coalition of the willing, the partners in crime. This has nothing to do with upholding civilization. It is plain and simple gang force methodology. The gangsters snub the principles of civilization and thereby trap themselves into a war against their own humanity. Afghanistan stands as a tragic example. In 1978, the monarchical government was overthrown with a coup d'etat that created an incompetent anti-Islamic socialist government. The Mujahideen emerged as the pro-Islam counterforce. The USA saw this as an opportunity to draw the Soviet Union into the quagmire and there to humiliate it with street gang terror tactics. For this, the Mujahideen became used, trained, motivated, and financed to the tune of $40 billion over 10 years to become the largest and most effective street terror gang in history that defeated the Soviet military machine and soon thereafter the Soviet-backed government in Afghanistan. However, when the deed was done, the Soviets were defeated, the government lay in shambles, the vast crime gang was left to fend for itself. The Al-Qaeda networks of fundamental Islamic orientation became the abundant gang's logistical base, primarily financed through Saudi Arabia. The term Al-Qaeda simply means the base. The Taliban emerged from a similar kind of background, primarily from the refugee camps in Pakistan. It was financed by whoever had an interest in keeping the new Islamic State of Afghanistan destabilized. The Taliban chose the ultra-fundamentalist Shia Hazaras as their apostates, which were later massacred when they were deemed to be not radical enough. The gang terror crimes, once they had been unleashed, had turned cities into killing fields in which many thousands were massacred in ethnic and political cleansing orgies. The victims included the Taliban themselves when captured, especially after the Taliban had successfully occupied Mazar-Sharif. Reconciliation with the Taliban has so far not been achieved. The Taliban became nurtured by the horror stories of the Soviet and government crimes in response to the gang crimes aimed to topple them. The Taliban had learned their lesson, and in their own orgy of utter criminality and inhumanity had captured Kabul and other cities, and declared themselves the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. They were displaced, of course, by the United States invasion. To date, no reconciliation has been achieved or is intended, as the Taliban continues to be financed. Even before the US invasion happened, a mere third of the 45,000 Taliban and Al-Qaeda that stood against the government of the Islamic State of Afghanistan were Afghans themselves. The rest of the people were imported. With the American invasion, the war tragedy expanded. 45 countries now have joined the war. The gang force method has now become legitimized, as if the crimes committed by overwhelming force become softened under the umbrella of organized plurality, with much of the Western world becoming participants. On this pluralistic platform of the Wall Street gang, The Iraq War was later unleashed, in spite of the fact that the US Constitution prohibits any attacks of other nations, which should have prevented the financing of the Mujahideen at the very beginning. The financing of the Mujahideen was a crime against the nation. The plurality of the gang participation was used to bypass the Constitution, and this ever more so. People in the war zone, unfortunately, suffer the consequences of the endless streams of crime that have now gone on for 34 years. Now, with the most horrendous crimes having been unleashed, with the uranium gas warfare, a normal future for the nation and its children drifts ever farther out of sight. How many of them will have the privilege of having a normal life again is hard to determine. A normal world is no longer on the agenda. The objective of empire is not to win wars, but to extend them, perpetuate them, and expand them. The objective is not to heal humanity, but to injure and destroy it, to keep it impotent. The objective is the same financially. Empire and war is one. Empire is the real enemy of Afghanistan. Empire finances the Taliban. Some of it with proceeds from dope operations that the Wall Street gang protects in Afghanistan. And so, after 10 years of war, the Taliban is bigger than ever, expanding and extending the war further and further without end in sight, exactly as the policies of empire demand. Of course, as the war expands, the casualties increase, and the dying increases with it on all fronts, while the nation loses its strength. The so-called international assistance that poured into Afghanistan in the form of the Wall Street gang has brought the most deep-reaching debilitations into the life of the people of Afghanistan, the kind of debilitations that result from the modern uranium warfare. The assistance did not come in the form of economic development. The active agent in this war is uranium. Uranium is radioactive. It remains so even when it is vaporized into a fine dust, too fine to be visible, so fine that it mingles with the air and becomes a deadly gas. The weapons that produce this dust are thereby potent killers and never-ending latent killers. Uranium bombs and munitions are ideal for the infinite crime. They are inexpensive to produce in large quantities and cause unavoidable consequences for all of humanity. They match both parameters of the infinite crime. They are cheap and lethal. They match perfectly the cesspool's requirement for the effective mass kill of humanity for an endless span of time. The uranium gas war is activated by placing large quantities of uranium into bombs and munitions. Uranium is an extremely heavy and brittle metal that becomes flammable on impact. On impact, uranium burns with an extremely high temperature exceeding 5,000 degrees Celsius. That's equal or hotter than the surface of the sun. Uranium is thereby ideal for making bombs with. The Desert Storm War in Iraq in 1991 was the first big proving ground of uranium munitions. The Iraqi military had been coerced to surrender its position in Kuwait, and as it did, on its return, a storm of uranium munitions was poured onto the returning forces that annihilated them all. It came to light as a totally different form of warfare, as some soldiers reported in the newspapers. "It's the biggest 4th of July show you've ever seen," they said. "And to see those tanks just boom, and more stuff just keeps coming spewing out of them. They just become white hot. It's wonderful. We toasted him. We hit the jackpot. A turkey shoot. It's like shooting fish in a barrel. Basically, they're just sitting ducks. There's just nothing like it." In the intensely high-temperature explosion, the uranium becomes vaporized into an infinitesimal fine dust, with dust flakes smaller than the wavelengths of light, whereby the dust becomes invisible and becomes a part of the air. The radioactive presence in the air was so thick that it could be measured with instrumentation as far away as England. The invisible dust from the explosions, that was thick also in the theater of operations, has probably killed many of the pilots, with cancers of all sorts, many years after the missions had been flown. A case was reported in which an Iraqi tank was hit. The resulting heat wave of the uranium explosion was so intense that children playing nearby had their clothing and their skin instantly burned off. Uranium is loved by the military because it penetrates the steel of armor like a hot knife cutting through butter. The soldiers inside the tanks, of course, suffered terribly. Those who saw the remains called them crispy critters. The vaporized uranium dust mixes with the air and behaves like a gas in the air that spreads across the world, but even widely dispersed as an invisible dust that hangs over the world, the uranium it contains loses none of its radioactive properties. This means that even now, the air that people breathe has become a radiation-emitting poison. The poison flows with the air currents and the jet streams and gets dispersed across the hemisphere, in some cases within just days, and eventually becomes spread globally. All of this has already happened. The air of the world has been effectively poisoned. The poison is now affecting hundreds of millions of people, and severely so in many cases. In the Yugoslav, Afghanistan, and Iraqi wars, approximately 5 million kilograms of uranium have been dispensed with the various types of bombs and munitions. In the shadow of this type of warfare, worldwide diabetes too has increased from 30 million cases to 230 million cases, a more than 7-fold increase. In the war areas, the effects were evidently much worse and much more grotesque, like cases of stomach and breast cancers in teenagers, and birth defects increasing 50-fold in some areas. The severity of the defects is beyond description. Of the returning soldiers from the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, 500,000 were classified as permanently disabled. They were suffering from over 90 different types of diseases, which became simply called the Gulf War syndromes. And this is the result of what may be termed as just the beginning, as all efforts have failed so far to achieve a worldwide ban of uranium use in weapons, with stockpiles already laid up for a potential 100-fold increase. Uranium radiation occurs in the form of alpha particles being emitted by an atomic decay process. An alpha particle is a tiny nucleonic cluster made up of 2 protons and 2 neutrons. The nucleonic cluster is emitted with great speed like a flying bullet. The bullet is relatively large. It encounters many barriers in its path, so that it doesn't penetrate far. A heavy sheet of paper can block it, or clothing, or a person's skin. For this reason, alpha radiation is considered low-level radiation. However, when the uranium that produces the radiation is vaporized into a fine dust smaller than the wavelengths of light, the tiny, invisible uranium dust flakes can be likened to airborne cannons that are inhaled with the air that become transported in a person's bloodstream to every place in the body where blood flows. In comparison with a red blood cell, the DU dust particles may be likened to the size of a cat when compared with a 10-story house. The radioactive uranium dust flakes become a part of the nourishment intake that is transported in the bloodstream. The vaporized uranium flakes are so small that they can get carried deep into the body's cells. There, the danger begins when the uranium dust emits its alpha radiation. The radiation bullets are now close enough to damage the DNA chains from within and upset the delicate chemical balance in a cell. Then, later, when a damaged cell begins to replicate with its DNA now modified, the replicated cell no longer acts as a team player in the biological system, but does its own thing and becomes a growing cancer, or causes other forms of organic dysfunctions. The 500,000 Gulf War veterans who were permanently disabled in this manner, with a range of over 90 different diseases, are examples of this type of dysfunction that we can't afford to see 100-fold increase of. What we see already without this increase is far too scary for one to remain indifferent. The 6-fold increase in lung cancers that CNN reported in 2006 is unimaginable with 100-fold increased magnitude, and more so are the birth defects that are already horrifically grotesque. Since the start of the worldwide uranium pollution of the air, up to 500 million people may have been affected. In our now poisoned world, whenever a person dies of cancer, the probability is high that the death is a latent casualty of war. The probability may be as high as 85% for some cancers. The long-term durability of the poison renders the uranium war casualties, primarily of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, as the largest casualties of war in the entire history of warfare on the planet, and this, while the dying and disabling effects will most likely continue for many thousands of years yet to come. Even today, more than a third of all babies born in our time are expected to be diabetic in 2050. That's hard to imagine. India is especially hard hit in this respect. India is located downwind in the jet streams from where the enormous uranium pollution originated, and China is located right behind it. China was probably just as badly affected by the close proximity to the source of the poisoning. In India, the end-stage kidney disease, where dialysis treatment or a kidney replacement is required, the incidence of the disease already occurs tens of years earlier in India in people in comparison to anywhere else. The disease begins in India on an average at the age of 32 to 42, compared with 60 to 63 years of age worldwide. And this too is getting worse worldwide. This single effect all by itself threatens to overwhelm the healthcare capabilities in future years, provided humanity survives this long. Even the sharp increase in obesity that has been observed from the 1990s on may have been caused in part by the massive uranium poisoning of the air that like an invisible cloud hangs over the world. Ironically, obesity is a state of gross malnutrition that is caused when the body becomes unable to metabolize food correctly. The starvation increases the need for food intake to compensate for the imbalance, whereby a lot of excess fat gets simply stored away in fatty tissue. Obesity is said to have quadrupled in Britain in the last 2 decades, in the time frame of the DU wars. While we know far too little about the impact of the uranium poisoning of the world that has already occurred, and while the little that is known is immensely frightening, the masters of the infinite crime are nevertheless prepared to increase the poisoning of the world 100-fold. The nations that oppose any restrictions on uranium use in weapons, or even the reporting of the logistics of them, are the USA, the United Kingdom, Israel, and France. In 1996, the International Court of Justice gave an advisory opinion on the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons. The court made it clear that international law on poisonous weapons, the Second Hague Declaration of 1899, the Hague Convention 4 of 1907, and the Geneva Protocol of 1925, did not cover nuclear weapons for reasons that their prime or exclusive use is not to poison or asphyxiate. Thus, by legalizing these weapons, the court indicts itself as a defender of the crimes of empire, rather than one that would arrest the crimes. In 1996 and 1997, a subcommittee of the United Nations Human Rights Commission passed 2 motions that listed weapons of mass destruction, which included in the list all weaponry containing depleted uranium. The United Nations Working Paper was delivered in 2002 by the Subcommission on the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights in a resolution where it was argued that the use of depleted uranium in weapons, along with other weapons, listed by the subcommission may breach any one of 7 or more of the following treaties: the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Charter of the United Nations, the Genocide Convention, the United Nations Convention Against Torture, the Geneva Conventions, including Protocol 1, the Convention on Conventional Weapons of 1980, and the Chemical Weapons Convention. These numerous United Nations resolutions, charters, and conventions that condemn uranium use in weapons have evidently no meaning for the dictators of the USA anymore, to whom the nation's own supreme law, its federal constitution, means nothing anymore either, unless it is convenient to do so. By his own actions, the President of the United States has reduced himself to below the rank of a common criminal. A common criminal typically robs his neighbors and may kill a person in the process, but he doesn't violate the supreme law of the land and threatens to wage war on mankind. However, the modern president carries this criminal action to such extremes, for which the preparations are already in progress. So, with the highest officer of the land spitting on the law on which the power of his office rests, who then stands up to protect your future? Who stands up to protect your life? Do you stand up? Can you imagine what your future would be like if the uranium war horse would be increased 100-fold? How few can even imagine the depths of the tragedy that is already happening? If your imagination doesn't reach that far, then listen to the story of a single person living in Afghanistan. He tells us, "After the Americans destroyed our village and killed many of us, we lost most of our houses and have nothing to eat. However, we would have endured these miseries and even accepted them if the Americans had not sentenced us all to death. When I saw my deformed grandson, I realized that my hopes of the future have vanished for good. This is different from the hopelessness of the Russian barbarism, even though at that time I lost my older son Shafiqullah. This time, however, I know we are part of the invisible genocide brought on us by America, a silent death from which I know we will not escape. Of course, what affects us human beings also affects every other form of life, from insects to birds that make their living in the air. In the years following the Afghan and Gulf Wars, 30% to 50% of the bee colonies in the Northern Hemisphere have become disabled. In some areas, up to 90%. All sorts of speculations are heard about the cause for it, and only the most likely cause, the DU cause, is never mentioned. We may have all also noticed the general reduction of insect and bird populations occurring in the same time frame. Can anyone still remember the constant chirping of the birds in the spring? It has become rare now. We are moving towards a silent spring, and far more so when the poisoning of the air is increased 100-fold. Reports indicate that during the Yugoslav, Gulf and Afghanistan wars, roughly 5,000 tons of uranium was dispensed in DU weapons of all kinds. It was revealed in later years that the USA had a stockpile of 3 million uranium bombs and munitions pre-positioned in South Korea, all by itself. Evidently, this was destined to be used against North Korea. Estimates have it that the 3 million pieces of DU ordnance contain approximately 67 million kilograms of uranium. This adds up to a near 14-fold increase over the entire amount used in the Yugoslav, Iraq and Afghanistan wars together. If one considers that North Korea is a tiny target in comparison with Iran, it is reasonable to assume that a vastly larger portion, possibly 7 to 8 times the Korean amount, is likely kept in store against Iran and Syria and so forth. The resulting bottom line would easily add up to a 100-fold increase in the amount of uranium that would, in the now prepared 4 wars, be poured into the environment over Syria and Iran and a lot of other places once the new round of wars starts. Can we afford the resulting 100-fold increase in the poisoning of the world in comparison with all the previous wars? The answer is no. But can this high rate of poisoning be physically accomplished? Here, the answer is yes. There is plenty enough depleted uranium available in the world for this 100-fold increase. Depleted uranium is essentially a waste product that is of little value. It becomes valuable, however, when it is put in the bombs and sold to the military. Uranium is gold for the military. It cuts through armor and concrete like a hot knife cuts through butter. No other type of weapon comes even close to this amazing effectiveness. It flows through the steel hulls of ships as if they were made of paper. It flows through concrete in much the same manner. The big 30,000-pound massive ordnance penetrator bomb can cut through a concrete slab 60 feet thick. With these monster bombs and a lot of lesser big bombs, the 100-fold increase in the uranium poisoning of the world won't be far off once the big wars get going. But considering the immense global damage that the 5,000 tons of vaporized uranium have already caused, affecting hundreds of millions of people across the world to the present day, one wonders how a 100-fold increase of the non-military damage can be survived by anyone at all. This means that now, with the weapons laid up in vast quantities, as this appears to be the case according to the available evidence, no option remains open to mankind except to arrest the infinite crime in all its aspects before the final massacre of humanity begins. This means arresting empire and war together, which is one, so that there will never be any type of war, not even conventional war. There is no longer any such thing possible as conventional war. The door to war of any kind is now closed. Every war of every type becomes infinitely suicidal from now on. We don't even know what the long-term consequences will be of the poisoning of the air and the environment that has already been perpetrated so far, without adding 100 times more. Thus we find ourselves forced, for the second time in history, to live without war, and this time forever. The first time we did this was in 1648, after the third of the population of Europe had perished. the nations made a treaty with each other at the end of the 30 Years' War to live without war. The treaty did not only end the 30 Years' War, but it also set a new stage for civilization that stood its ground until the masters of empire succeeded in wrecking it again. We need to build in this direction, and to a much greater extent than it ever had been built before, even to the point of assuring that both empire and war are arrested together, or else all will be lost irreversibly. When our humanity blocks this crime in the heart sufficiently to overcome society's long-cultivated indifference, then the crime will be arrested in the universal forum where humanity makes its treaties with itself. That's the kind of breakthrough I'm aiming to prepare the ground for with my series of novels, The Lodging for the Rose. Till the breakthroughs are made, we have much work to do on this ground. We talk boldly about peace in the United Nations, while we stand impotent to win these little objectives for peace as banning the use of uranium in weapons, while we still have a world to live in, and a civilization with a faint spark of humanity remaining in the heart. We fail because we address the wrong issue. We aim for an easy solution, while we choose the impossible. The easy solution, which is in fact the only solution, would be to arrest the core drivers for the crime for which solutions must be found. And this core driver is empire, the heart of the infinite crime. If we fail here, while the world scene is still relatively sane, how can we hope to win when the little sanity that we still have left in the world today goes out the window in the rage of a big war that is now being prepared, while hardly anyone raises a finger to halt the process? And what is the war for? It isn't fought to elevate the nation, is it? The terms empire and war have at their core purse and power. The benign empire is a mirage, a fake sun. Empire nurtures nothing but itself. Now, with the infinite crime no longer being regarded as a crime, Afghanistan has become somewhat a holiday resort for all the willing warriors of the world. The Wall Street gang protects the poppy fields that feeds the biggest opium operations in the world. Isn't dope the main base of Wall Street gang operations? The street gang war is also for control, establishing destabilizing control right across the entire region. Both of these objectives are forms of attacking other nations. They are thereby illegal objectives under the United States Constitution. But does anybody care? Under the United States Constitution, all the American wars since 1945 were conducted illegally. Nor are the currently planned wars against Syria and Iran, or whatever other wars are still planned, any less illegal. Even the ongoing preparations for these wars should be deemed a crime under the Constitution. The very planning for new illegal wars constitutes a criminal act, since the preparations are made for the purpose of committing a crime. This means that the placement of the 5 aircraft carrier groups off the shores of Syria and Iran in 2011 and 2012 as a threatening posture against these nations is a criminal act under the United States Constitution, because the threatening posture is designed to solicit war. All persons complicit in these crimes, regardless of their rank in office, by their involvement render themselves liable for criminal prosecution and for compensation claims. But why hasn't this basic criminality been arrested? Mankind is not a slave by design, but is an infinite species with great power in its expression and a profound freedom in its soul. Shouldn't this most basic crime of attacking entire nations, which violates a whole raft of laws, be instantly arrested by an infinite species? By failing to do this, humanity makes a mockery of itself. While there exists no court in the USA, or for that matter in the world, to prosecute the infinite crimes, which are essentially basic crimes, and to deal with the compensation claims for the resulting damages, it is highly likely that such courts will yet become established to deal with this basic criminality, as there exists ample logged evidence about who organized the crime and who carried them out from start to finish. If all the people responsible for criminal acts against the nation and humanity would be prosecuted fully under the law, especially according to their rank in the crime, the ongoing crime would be arrested and further crimes would be prevented, while they can still be prevented. In real terms, the prosecutions would be just a token, as the crime has become so huge that it is massively destroying humanity and threatens to eradicate all life, for which monetary compensations is not possible. Of course, the trail of crimes for the prosecution should also be pursued right up to the highest thrones of the global empire, which has amply demonstrated itself all through the history of humanity as being the enemy of mankind and the only enemy mankind has. The resulting prosecutions against the infinite crime should therefore be especially focused on the very core of the crime of war. If the prosecution of the basic crime would be pursued honestly, humanity would have a chance to have a future again, which it presently denies itself by failing to recognize the core of the package, which is empire, that has dragged many patriotic elements of the nations into becoming complicit with empire's perpetual crime against humanity, which is both basic and infinite. Empire and war is one. It is the name of the package. It is a single name of a single package. It is the name of the dragon that perpetuates the infinite crime. It flies on 2 wings, empire and war, and devours humanity in its flight. When one wing does not function, the crime does not fly. It needs 2 wings to fly. This means that the package is one and is itself the crime. It is the infinite crime, because the destruction of civilization is its consequence, and this consequence is infinite in scale. The dragon that symbolizes the infinite crime has no equivalent in the natural world. The symbol itself represents the mythological dreams of kings and queens and fierce warriors, who, as a package, rule with swords and axes, and the cross and the stake, who, by their devotion to the crime, put their opponents to death under the glitter of so many royal crowns. The nature of the package of the infinite crime has been well understood by the artists of old. Now in modern time, with depleted uranium added to the theater of war, war has progressed to a choke point where humanity becomes potentially self-terminating. The mythological name of the dragon has been pinned onto man. This, too, has been understood by those who have eyes to see. But this deception, too, does not hide the mythological name of the package, that is the infinite crime. Society is doomed by casting itself in the role of those who swing the sword. It belittles itself thereby into impotence and ultimately into indifference. It is physically doomed by the outcome of its indifference to what it has long understood about the nature of the crime being committed against it. It stands supremely doomed today, thereby, unless by some consecrated efforts at this late stage, society arrests its indifference and regains its sovereignty as human beings. The hope is still on the table that humanity's indifference to the infinite crime will be terminated before the crime terminates all of humanity. Hope remains. The crime in progress can still be arrested, with society restoring its sovereignty. But time is running out. The final end of civilization is near. The act of terminating its indifference means for society to reassert its sovereignty as a free people. This is humanity's ticket for survival. It means arresting the giant, the system of empire, that is a system of war in a single package. Empire equals war. Humanity is not a part of this package, but a target, as in gang attacks. Society stands for humanity, but is drowned with betrayal. Humanity cannot afford to remain indifferent to its own nature and the nature of the package of the infinite crime that stands against it, that is artificial and mythological. In Goya's painting, a donkey stands serenely indifferent to it all, but the human being is not a donkey. Humanity should never have stood indifferent to the power of its sovereign spirit that is a real and native element of the human being. And by the same token, humanity should have never stood indifferent to the mythological forces arrayed against it, that it has the power to arrest, and always had this power. The law of the United States Constitution still stands today as the supreme law designed to prevent the infinite crime. But it means nothing if it is not upheld sufficiently by society to be its law. Only a world without empire is a world without war. War cannot be arrested in isolation. Empire and war is one, reads the banner, and this one is the infinite crime. This fact remains yet to be understood and be acknowledged scientifically. The sculpture at the United Nations headquarters in New York represents a failure of perception of the infinite crime. The world seeks peace, but allows the gun to remain in the world. The gun represents war. The gun is allowed to remain on the assumption that its effects can be blocked, which is not possible in the real world. The failure of perception that allows the gun to remain conjures up the illusion that war can be tied into knots so effectively that it will not harm humanity. This illusion now stands behind the greatest tragedy in the world. The illusion is a part of society's deception by the masters of empire, who inspire in society a self-deception that breeds the very indifference that the criminals desire. Indifference is not native to the human mind. It is artificial in nature and is intentionally nurtured. In the real world, the gun is war, and the invisible hand that holds the gun is empire. Empire and war is one. The infinite crime is the most deadly element in the world. It shreds the fabric of civilization. It is a disease that has festered for millennia in an increasingly indifferent world and has thereby tightened the noose around humanity's neck. For as long as the gun is held by the invisible hand, by the doctrine of empire, the trigger remains in reach to be pulled. For as long as the trigger is within reach, it will be pulled by one or some of the countless sly little creatures, the madmen who have drowned their soul and their humanity in the cesspool of empire, who, kneeling deep in the mud at their master's feet, obey their master's very command. According to reports in 2012, the acting United States Secretary of Defense, Leon Panetta, claims or suggests that the United States President does not require congressional approval for any military attack on any nation in the world, but requires only international support in order to pull the trigger for war. His take is that nothing more than this is required. This is to say, that the President only needs to have the support of his masters, the masters of empire, the masters of the cesspool, who command him. On the basis of this newly proclaimed authorization, the U.S. President, the commander-in-chief of the greatest military force in the world, blares the trumpet of war. He blares the trumpet of the infinite crime and thereby renders himself as an infinite criminal by intention and by deeds already done, as one of the long line of other presidential infinite criminals who have earned their place in the halls of infamy before him. A sane society would have this man impeached and prosecuted long ago, which countless voices have indeed succeeded, and repeatedly so, like a broken record. This time the President of the infinite crime blares the trumpet against Syria and Iran. This means that a big war is on the agenda, the final war, the long-feared World War III with Russia and China that is poised to destroy the world. The infinite crime is now fully on the table, ready to go. It has been put there with all the pomp and circumstance and great fanfares, posturing, speeches, and media coverage of the kind that are traditionally uttered to legitimize the infinite crime. Yes, the war with Russia and China is on the table. It is on the table because of these nations' refusal to allow themselves to be dragged into the open cesspool of empire and be drowned there. With the cesspool itself fast collapsing, which is functionally already dead. The cesspool demands the same for humanity as a whole, under the illusion that empire can be kept thereby in control by drowning the nations either in its muck or in its wars. Under this illusion, the cesspool's countless little men and stooges, who bow their heads to pray to empire, while they swallow the cesspool's sludge and swear their most holy oaths as faithful servants, promise to reduce the world to ashes on the demands of those whom they call master. That's what stands behind the war cries for the capturing of Asia, which means, for starters, the destruction of Syria and Iran, and potentially also North Korea. These first-in-line targets are as close as one can get to the main targets. In the age of radioactive uranium gas warfare, one doesn't actually need to get any closer to destroying the populations of the main targets. Of course, a war adventure of this nature is a thinly veiled cry for nuclear war. A nuclear war is ultimately intended by the masters of the cesspool to eliminate Russia, China, and also the USA and 90% of humanity with them from the global landscape. This adds up to a far-flung plan for eradicating all the forces that have the power to arrest empire. Towards this end, the infinite crime stands to ravish the world once again. The ravishing is a part of the package of empire. Yes, all the cries for depopulation in their countless disguises are inherent elements of the infinite crime. Depopulation is by its very nature an infinite crime. The crime is already in progress in the form of the Holocaust of hunger under the biofuels doctrine, which is killing 100 times as many people than Hitler's Holocaust had killed. It is carried out in silence by the most supreme criminals in the world, who now threaten their crime to become total, who have the gun already cocked for eradicating all opposition to empire by whatever means this can be achieved. And so the stage is set for the big war to happen, to eradicate 6 billion people. Syria, Iran, and potentially North Korea, all set up to serve as the trigger, the kind of trigger that Russia and China must respond to unless they are willing to lay themselves down to die. With the uranium war potentially now setting up a deadly stage, it is not possible for Russia and China to stand idly by, because the consequences of the uranium gas war are the most deadly consequences of all the forms of the infinite crime to date, including the crime of burning food in a starving world and the staging of a thermonuclear war for extermination. With the dawn of the uranium gas war, a new stage for warfare has been set. We stand on this stage with the most deadly weapon ever. When World War II ended, the killing of the populations stopped. When the guns fell silent, when the last bombing run ended, the horrible dying unleashed by this war had ground to a halt. The cities were rebuilt. Now, however, since the dawn of the use of depleted uranium in the weapons of war, a new stage has been set on which the dying and suffering and destruction continues on forever, unabated, long after the wars themselves have ended and are forgotten. The uranium poisoning of the air is accumulative. With each successive war, more of the radioactive poison accumulates, which, like a gas, pervades first the air and later the ground and becomes a part of the environment in which we live. The radiation of uranium decays slowly. It has a half-life of 4.5 billion years. In this context, the scene of the aftermath of the bombing of Dresden was a scene of paradise, in which the war-destroyed world could be rebuilt, and was rebuilt. This is no longer possible. We cannot get back to the state of the world that existed before the depleted uranium wars began. The entire world is presently already trapped into these long, enduring consequences, expressed in a wide range of biological effects that will be suffered for all times to come. The poison that has been injected into the air and the global environment cannot be cleaned up. It is of a type that has never existed before in the entire history of the world, and it is here to stay. All that we can do from now on is to prevent the already planned further accumulation. This necessitates ending the epoch of war for all times to come. This means no more war, not a single war, not ever. The color of war can no longer be ignored. War is and always has been a crime against humanity. It now stands before us as the most supreme crime, a crime against life and the future. And those who play the trumpet of war stand proudly before us as the most supreme criminals in the world, because humanity in its indifference as an already defeated society allows them to stand and have their way. That's where we find ourselves today, the people of the world, collectively. We find ourselves mired in the sludge of indifference, impotent while facing death on an unimaginable scale. This means that in order to survive, humanity has no choice but to snap itself out of its collective indifference, to end the most supreme crime against life itself, which is war, and to arrest the most supreme criminals, the war criers, and to arrest empire, the most supreme crime ever perpetrated against mankind. We should not be at this stage at all where we are at, but we also, because we have thus far lacked the humanity in the heart to block the infinite crimes. War and empire should have been arrested ages ago, but society has let them go on. It kept saying that it is too hard to arrest war and empire from the landscape of civilization, that it is too hard to arrest the infinite crime. The key for our survival therefore lies in rebuilding the principle of humanity in the heart, into the greatest force of life on the planet, for the protection of life, liberty, and civilization, which means happiness. This we can accomplish as human beings. It is possible to arrest war and empire together, which can only be arrested together as one single phenomenon, because empire and war is one single crime, though it has many facets. On this platform of the Keplerian type of recognition, it is possible to end the infinite crime in the world. War and empire, the infinite crime, have soiled the landscape of civilization for far too long already. The Treaty of Westphalia that once arrested war and empire across Europe and set the stage for modern civilization needs to be rebuilt. The arresting of war and empire, in whatever form they may be found, old or new, and there are many such forms, needs to be accomplished in modern times in an emergency-type fashion before the next increment of war starts that threatens to increase the already existing radioactive poisoning of the world up to 100-fold. Will there be war and empire on the planet? Will the infinite crime ravish the world? Or will there be life in the future? These are the questions before us now. The key, this time, is located on Capitol Hill and its interplay with society. Will there be indifference and doom in our future, or the existence of a sovereign humanity free of war and empire? This is the key issue for today. Today, society stands on the side of the infinite crime, and therefore its own doom. It stands in this inhuman mode, because indifference demands so much less than what society standing tall for its sovereignty would demand of it. However, now that the infinite crime has become absolute on all fronts, indifference comes with an immense price tag attached that has already become unbearable. So why shall anyone remain indifferent? Today's price tag for indifference should be recognized as being immense, which it really is, though it is rarely recognized as such. It is not surprising, therefore, that the huge danger of the uranium warfare isn't recognized either, because it is intentionally hidden as a part of the infinite crime. If the imminent danger before us became generally known, the natural response from the heart of humanity would shut the entire military-industrial complex down. At this point it would become recognized that all the engines of war are auxiliaries of the infinite crime, and are in the world of civilization essentially in the form of useless junk. Of course, if this recognition would dawn, the entire war industry would have to be converted to produce useful products for once. However, since the military-industrial complex wields great political power, no effort is spared by it to hide the reality that all of its products are hyper-expensive junk. The critical nature of the uranium weapons impasse has therefore become hidden by the advocates of the infinite crime in a desperate effort to keep their scourge of the crime alive and to keep its engines flying and the production lines running. There is gold for the weapons makers in the perceived need for weapons. The dying of humanity is of no consequence to the really high-minded, whose humanity has been drowned in the cesspool. Nor is truth a concern for them. No lies will be spared to assure society that uranium weapons are efficient and don't pose a problem, and that radioactive gas warfare is totally harmless, so that all those millions who have already died of it can be deemed to have died of natural causes. The banner "In Lies We Trust" is easily defended in the uranium gas war arena because the typical rigorous smoking gun evidence is not physically possible, of the type that would stand up as proof for the uranium-caused damage. It isn't possible to ever deliver such proof, since the deadly particles that kill people by the millions are smaller than the wavelengths of light. They are visible only with electron microscopes. Only the coincidental evidence exists, which can be easily denied under the banner "In Lies We Trust." This is one of the reasons why the big engines of war are still flying today, and war and empire, the infinite crime, remains unassailed in the world. Visible evidence can be produced in the laboratory. In real life, people won't know about the damage for a few years after the damage has been done. And even after the radioactive damage is taking its toll, as in the CNN report that lung cancer in the USA has jumped 6-fold in 2006, the cause was said to be a sudden change in the smoking habits. Indeed, in lies we trust. But is the depleted uranium warfare poisoning of the world really so critical, especially as far away from the battlefield as the USA, that the danger should finally impel society to arrest the infinite crime and the criminals that have blackened history for millennia? The answer is yes. That is why the crime of uranium warfare is covered up. The term depleted uranium, or DU for short, is one of the numerous special terms that are used in the infinite crime to cover up the crime. These terms all involve deceptions of various types. The term depleted uranium is in no way different. It is essentially a lie that enables the continued use of the uranium weapons. Depleted uranium has not been depleted or even weakened of the radioactive property of uranium, which, when vaporized into an infinite dust so that it will be inhaled by people, becomes the longest enduring killer of life ever invented, with a half-life of over 4.5 billion years. Depleted uranium is depleted only of a portion of a rare trace element by about 0.5% in volume that is useful for nuclear power reactors and the making of nuclear bombs. By the deceptive nature of the term depleted uranium, or DU as it is referred to in short, the indefensible killer of people has remained in active use in spite of worldwide efforts to ban it. The term depleted uranium is as cleverly deceptive as are all the other special terms that have been invented to enhance the infinite crime. With the infinite crime having festered for millennia and having grown worse, a new type of warfare has emerged, by which indifference comes with the tallest price tag attached. War has become a crime against life itself. It has become a crime against the very blueprint of life in all its forms, including its human expression. We see a vast jump in birth defects, both in numbers and in ugliness, since the uranium wars began. War has suddenly become a crime of annihilation on the broad front. We face a new and infinite type of genocide now. The only thing that is not new on this scene is that the genocide is still the result of indifference. Indifference rules by default in a world without sovereignty. Indifference results when sovereignty is lost. Indifference rules the world today so strongly that the combined effort of humanity has not been sufficient to ban the uranium weapons that mutilate all life, for which we now face potentially 100-fold increase, according to the preparations that have already been made in prepositioned weaponry. It won't be easy to create a world without empire and without war. Too many people are profiting from empire and war. It seems that humanity has lost its skills for living at peace. A lot of growing up will need to be done before both the weapons and empire that demands the weapons are laid aside. However, we have also proven ourselves to be fast learners and to be capable of grand achievements if we put our mind to the task. Of course, the time to do this is now, and to do this radically and completely, to arrest war before it explodes anew. It is not possible to stop war and empire partially. We cannot arrest the infinite crime and embrace it at the same time. A narcissist cannot accomplish the task that is required to put the weapons aside. He cannot comprehend such a concept. He will not yield from war. The current U.S. President Obama appears to fit the pattern of the narcissist mental disease. The mentally impaired wear no badge. Still, the victims of the disease are identifiable. The cause is poorly understood, but is most often related in nature to post-traumatic stress disorders. The impaired suffer from what one might call a culturally induced psychological disorder. The victims typically have a grandiose sense of self-importance, are preoccupied with fantasies of unlimited success, power, brilliance, have a distorted sense of beauty, irrational ideals, and they believe that they are unique and special above all other people, cultures, and even races. They seek excessive admirations with a strong sense of entitlement, but even as they almost demand this slavish attention, they are interpersonally exploitative and lack empathy to the point of being arrogant and haughty in behaviors and attitudes. This seems to be the general consensus of a wide range of research with victims of the post-traumatic stress disorder or culturally inherited psychological disorder. When such mental impairments are discovered in leaders of nations, the affected persons need to be removed from office as an emergency response, especially so if they have the power within their reach to commit the infinite crime of global suicidal warfare. The impaired need to be removed from such offices of power decisively, just as any criminal would be so removed to protect society. Because to fail to do this, in the case of national leaders, would be paramount to inviting the universal extinction of humanity that the presently available weaponry assures. The cesspool masters evidently comprehend the danger they have placed on society by their financing a dangerously impaired person to high posts of power. They have done this before, and it had nearly cost them their empire. They fear the risks involved, but they fear the consequences of a normally developing humanity even more. They fear it because they would not survive it. Thus they encourage humanity to commit suicide. This appears to be their endgame now, as their empire is hopelessly collapsing all around them. All the money in the world that had been thrown into the bailout draft didn't help them one bit, because they had already killed the golden goose, the physical economy, by which every form of money gains its value. Consequently, in a kind of desperation, they aid their enemies to cut each other's throat, aiming to come out surviving at the end. The traditional method of financing a deeply impaired person to the highest post of power fulfills their modern requirements still perfectly, even if it will destroy the entire world this time, instead of merely much of Eurasia as was the case in World War II. This means that society needs to act in the case it has before it. A compromise is not possible. Society cannot move in two opposite directions at once, both for and against its own survival. We face a challenge with this now of a type and magnitude that we have never faced before. To clear the slate of all the sewer servants who have tortured the face of humanity for far too long already. Also, we face a new imperative for ending wars forever, with new demands, and with a new, as yet unwritten constitution that needs to be applied from the resources of our universal humanity by its own imperative. This movement towards sanity is presently blocked by the empire syndromes that inhibit sanity. Gang violence is one of the methods used to set aside sanity. Some call it a holiday from sanity. The ganging together enables crimes to be committed that individuals would be prohibited against by their inner humanity. The process of ganging up makes the crimes appear legitimate by the fog of mass consensus. Rape is an example. It enables individuals to rape who would never dream of doing such a thing by themselves. When in addition, artful advertising, like the one shown here for the 18th Street Gang, gives the gang process an air of legitimacy, then crime itself becomes legitimized thereby in the eyes of the beholder. The crime becomes okay then when it is committed by a coalition of the willing, who have become free from the constitution of their humanity and the principle of civilization. Nevertheless, the resulting, often indefensible force amassed by the gang coalition process does not render the crime for which it is applied any less a crime. In fact, it renders the crime more despicable. The empire uses this feature to terrorize society with invincible force. The Roman Empire existed almost exclusively by the terror force of its roving legions. Rome had become the Euro Street Gang that had nearly destroyed civilization altogether. The modern world empire lives by the same method. The leader of Libya, Gaddafi, was murdered by the modern Wall Street Gang, and the country was ravished by a civil war staged for this purpose. Now the gang owns the Libyan oil fields once again. The gang now calls itself openly the Coalition of the Willing. A recruited gang member is required to throw away its own constitution that would inhibit the crime. Afghanistan has been ravished in various ways for over 30 years by the Wall Street Gang. It has become the gang's world center for dope production, which is protected by military force, and it has become the central hub for destabilizing the entire surrounding region, with borders to Iran, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Pakistan, and even China. The ravishing of Afghanistan began long before the 9/11 terror attacks on the World Trade Center in New York City. Nor was the attack organized from Afghanistan, but it was used with splendid evidence to vilify Afghanistan, to take control of it by the gang. According to available evidence, the 9/11 attacks was a highly veiled Wall Street Gang operation that served the typical gang tactics of using terror to expand and deepen its control. The Wall Street Gang is now becoming ever more present in its attacks for control. Its demands for regime change in Syria by force serves purely strategic objectives. It is a gang crime unfolding that Russia and China are trying to prevent. The Wall Street Gang is also reaching out to take over Iran, or what is left of it after the crime has been committed, if indeed anything remains standing after the deed is done. The core objective of empire, however, which has organized the Wall Street Gang for its purposes, is to take control of Russia and China, and this means nuclear war. The patiently cultivated gang process is designed to assure that the normally impossible, such as nuclear war, becomes possible. By the gang process, the depleted uranium poisoning of the world has already become possible. Do we stand helpless against the gang war process, which is happening even while it is technically illegal? The answer depends on each one of us, doesn't it? Vaporized uranium has never been a part of the natural environment of our planet. With a radioactive half-life of 4.5 billion years, when it is vaporized into the environment where it affects all life for all times to come, would potentially transform our precious planet into a barren rock over time that would be devoid of life, an empty dead sphere in space, like the moon. It is incumbent on all of us, therefore, to prevent the further increase of the tragedy in order to protect our precious paradise of life, for which we have not yet found an equal in the universe as far as our telescopes can reach. This means no more war, no more gang wars, no more empire. It means no more imperialism, no more monetarism, no more looting of one another. It means building a world on the platform of human development and shutting down the platforms for predation. Nothing less will suffice. No compromise is possible when the only alternative to the right option is the wrong option that no one can survive. This is the only option that remains for us on the table, with which to arrest the plans for a massive bombing campaign against Syria and Iran that is poised to result in a radioactive gas war of immense proportions that would, ironically, still be called conventional war, though the term would no longer apply, because the war would become nuclear war within days. This defines the kind of task we face, and the kind of urgency with which we need to get on with it. The first indication that we will see when we get to this stage, as our proof of progress, is a new world unfolding before us, in which weapons of war of any kind, uranium weapons and nuclear weapons included, are no longer found, because they are understood to be to no one's advantage. They would then have been scrapped and be recycled into something useful, which we always had the power to do.